When US President Donald Trump decided to slap tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, it sent shockwaves through the global economy. Businesses, governments, and everyday people started wondering, what happens next? Trump's move was bold: a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico, and a 10% tariff on China. It wasn't long before the three countries hit back, questioning how the US planned to handle the fallout. At first, Trump put the tariffs on hold for Canada and Mexico, but China wasn't as lucky. In fact, some experts said certain Chinese goods were hit with tariffs as high as 60%. Naturally, China, along with Canada and Mexico, condemned the move. Beijing even threatened legal action, calling the tariffs unfair. But instead of just fighting back, China got creative. They needed a way around Trump's trade barriers, and they found it in Mexico. See, these tariffs weren't just about punishing China. Trump's goal was to fix the trade imbalance between the US and its biggest competitors. But in a twist, instead of backing down, companies started shifting production out of China and into Mexico. So that raises a big question. Can anyone actually win a trade war? And more importantly, what does this mean for the rest of the world? For China, Mexico became the perfect loophole. But how exactly did they pull it off? And what does this mean for US businesses and workers? Let's take a closer look at how China made its way around Trump's tariffs and what that means for the global economy. Before Donald Trump's tough trade policies came into play, something big was already happening in North America's economic landscape. Mexico was quietly taking the lead in US imports, surpassing China for the first time in over 2 decades. By 2023, Mexico had shipped a staggering $475 billion worth of goods to the US, an increase of $20 billion from the previous year. Several factors fueled this shift: growing tensions between Washington and Beijing, a push to bring manufacturing closer to home, and Mexico's rapidly expanding industrial sector. But there was another force at work, one that wasn't making headlines at first. Chinese companies had found a backdoor into the American market, and that backdoor was wide open in Mexico. A prime example? The Alianza Industrial Park, sitting just 250 kilometers from the US border. While originally designed to support Mexico's booming auto industry, it quickly became a hotspot for Chinese manufacturers looking for a way around US tariffs. In just a few years, the number of Chinese companies operating in Mexico's industrial zones had doubled. In Alianza alone, major Chinese firms producing high-end car parts were pouring over $1 billion into new facilities, working side by side with global automotive giants. Excavators rumbled non-stop, trucks rolled in and out, and massive new factories sprang up. Signs in both Mandarin and English welcomed new Chinese investors, signaling a growing presence that was impossible to ignore. Right next door, German automaker Daimler Truck and multinational powerhouse Stellantis had been building vehicles for over a decade. Meanwhile, suppliers from the US and Europe were churning out essential components: windows, wiring harnesses, and everything in between. But here's where things got complicated. China wasn't just setting up shop in Mexico for fun. It was using the country's free trade agreement with the US and Canada, known as the USMCA, to sidestep tariffs. And Washington took notice. The sudden surge of Chinese investment in Mexico wasn't just a business move. It was a strategic play, and policymakers in both the US and Canada were starting to sound the alarm. Connor Pfiffer, a director at the US national security think tank FDD Action, put it bluntly. Mexico's proximity to the US gave Chinese companies a unique advantage. While other nations, like Vietnam, were also attracting Chinese investment, Mexico's central role in North American trade made it a game changer. And it wasn't just Pfiffer raising concerns. Trump's pick for Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau were both wary of China's growing influence. They saw what was happening and feared that Mexico was becoming a loophole in Trump's trade war. With the USMCA set for review in 2026, the question wasn't whether China would continue its expansion in Mexico, but how the US and Canada would respond. Official Mexican government figures put Chinese and Hong Kong investment at $450 million last year, just 2% of total foreign investments. but independent research painted a different picture. Real estate data from Sila, a market analytics firm, showed that Chinese companies were occupying twice as much industrial space in Mexico as they had 3 years earlier. While they only made up 3% of leased space, they had absorbed 7% of new capacity since 2020, making them the third largest players in Mexico's booming industrial market, behind only American and Mexican firms. For Mexico's new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, China's rising presence was becoming an unavoidable challenge. And according to Juan Carlos Baker, a former trade official, simply ignoring the issue wasn't an option. Something big is happening in northern Mexico, and it's catching the attention of both American politicians and business leaders. At the center of it all, a Chinese tire giant called ZC Rubber. ZC Rubber, China's largest automotive tire manufacturer, is rapidly expanding its footprint in Mexico's Alianza Industrial Park. In fact, nearly half of the billion-dollar investment pouring into the park from Chinese companies comes from them. When ZC Rubber broke ground on its factory in Coahuila last August, Mexican officials welcomed them with gifts, a hand-woven tapestry, and a statue of the nation's coat of arms, an eagle perched on a cactus, gripping a snake. Just a month later, another Chinese company arrived, and the celebration continued with red ribbon-cutting ceremonies and traditional Mexican dancers. It wasn't just a warm welcome, it was a sign of Mexico's growing effort to attract Chinese businesses. The governor of Coahuila, Manolo Jimenez, even traveled to the Beijing Auto Show this year to pitch the state as the perfect location for Chinese companies. He highlighted the region's security policies and its easy access to the U.S. market, hoping to draw in more investment. And it's working. Coahuila is now the second largest recipient of Chinese investment in Mexico, according to government data from 2023. But many experts believe the real numbers are much higher. Consulting firms like Rhodium Group suggest that China's actual investments could be as much as 6 times what official records show. This is because foreign direct investment (FDI) data often misses key transactions, making it hard to see the full picture. The hidden numbers reveal just how much Chinese money is flowing into Mexico and where it's going. Take Mexico Mart, a shopping center in downtown Mexico City with a sign in Mandarin above the entrance. Inside, dozens of vendors sell inexpensive Chinese imports. That was until last month when armed Marines shut it down in a dramatic government raid. Many saw the move as a message to the U.S., proof that Mexico was taking action against Chinese trade practices. But stopping China's economic influence in Mexico isn't as simple as shutting down a few stores. Mexico has become the United States' largest trading partner, surpassing China as Washington cut back on imports from Beijing during the trade war. That means Mexico is in a tough spot. It wants to maintain its economic ties with the U.S. while also benefiting from the surge in Chinese investment. And that's exactly what worries some American lawmakers. In September, Marco Rubio, Trump's nominee for Secretary of State, sent out a stark warning. The U.S. signed a free trade agreement with Mexico, not China. He called for immediate action to stop the Chinese government from using Mexico as a backdoor into the American market. But are these warnings making any difference? At Manzanillo, Mexico's largest port, Chinese shipments are only increasing. More than 40% of all containers arriving at the port come from China, according to shipping data. Analytics from freight monitoring firm Donata show that container shipments from China to Mexico have jumped by 19% in just the first 9 months of 2024. Some argue that China's presence in Mexico isn't as alarming as it seems. Many U.S. and Canadian companies still rely on Chinese imports, particularly for car parts and other manufacturing components. Enrique Dussel-Peters, a trade expert at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, believes the political debate is missing a key point. China and Mexico's economies are already deeply connected. Simply cutting off trade isn't realistic. Mexico's new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, has responded carefully. She's pushing for more local manufacturing to replace Chinese imports, emphasizing the importance of strong U.S.-Mexico relations without directly confronting Beijing. Meanwhile, business leaders like Francisco Gonzalez, who represents major auto industry suppliers, argue that the so-called Chinese takeover of Mexico is being blown out of proportion. Yes, Chinese companies are coming, but they're far from dominating the market. Luis Rosendo Gutierrez, Mexico's Undersecretary of International Trade, agrees. He dismisses the idea that China is using Mexico as a loophole to avoid U.S. tariffs, pointing out that Chinese investment levels remain low and that the U.S. and Canada still import plenty from China themselves. But this delicate balance could soon be upended. Trump's tariff policies might be making a comeback. And this time, the stakes are even higher. If he follows through, the economic impact on Mexico could be severe, since the country depends on the U.S. to buy more than 80% of its exports. And as history has shown, Trump isn't afraid to use tariffs not just as economic tools, but as political weapons. Tariffs might sound simple. They're just taxes on imported goods. But their impact is anything but. Who actually ends up paying for them? That depends on how businesses and governments react. And right now, Mexico is feeling the pressure. One of the biggest shifts in Mexico's trade with the U.S. has been in the auto industry. Cars and auto parts now make up more than a third of the country's growing share of U.S. imports. So, when new tariffs come into play, Mexico will need to find ways to balance its trade numbers. But should it do that by cutting ties with China? That's a question still up for debate. Leaders across North America are looking for ways to protect their industries, and China's growing presence in Mexico is a hot topic. The idea of shutting it down completely, however, is unrealistic. Nowhere is this more evident than in the auto sector, where Chinese manufacturers are quietly expanding their footprint. According to Mexico's National Association of the Auto Parts Industry, nearly 1,000 Chinese companies are operating in the sector. However, only 36 of them are actively producing in Mexico. Even so, their exports to the U.S. have surged by 50% in just 2 years. Francisco Gonzalez, who leads the association, argues that these Chinese companies aren't exactly flooding Mexico's market. In many cases, automakers specifically invited them in because they needed certain parts. China's auto industry simply saw an opportunity and took it. Ironically, some American auto jobs actually depend on parts made by Chinese firms in Mexico. That's why cutting ties entirely with China isn't just difficult, it's nearly impossible. It's not just the US either. Canada, Germany, and other global players all rely on Chinese-made components. Take General Motors, for example. The company is one of the biggest importers of Chinese products into Mexico. Today, 1 out of every 5 cars sold in Mexico is made in China, including GM's Chevrolet Aveo, which has become a top seller. Or worse, at least from the US perspective, exporting Chinese-made EVs into the American market. So far, no factories have been announced. But industry insiders say that Chinese automakers are actively scouting locations. And that's why this issue has landed on Trump's radar during his campaign. But it's not just about cars. The US sees China's growing footprint in Mexico as a bigger problem, one that extends beyond manufacturing. Companies like Huawei, the controversial Chinese telecom giant, are also expanding their influence. What happens if a large percentage of Mexicans and Americans living in Mexico start driving Chinese-made cars connected to Chinese technology? If that future becomes reality, concerns about cybersecurity and data privacy will grow even more intense. Some U.S. officials say it would be an even bigger headache than the battle over Huawei's network infrastructure. As Trump's second term nears its end, Mexico will be forced to navigate this tricky situation, and the U.S. will have to decide how hard it wants to push back against China's expanding reach. But the real shock didn't come from Washington. It came from Ottawa. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and other officials have floated the idea of kicking Mexico out of the USMCA trade deal. Their reasoning? Concerns that China is using Mexico as a backdoor into North America's market. For Mexico, this was an unexpected blow. But Canada has its own election coming up in 2025, and Trudeau is under pressure to protect Canadian auto jobs. That makes Mexico a convenient target. At first, Mexico's new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, was dismissive of Trump's tariff threat. But that changed after their meeting. Now, Sheinbaum is signaling a willingness to work with the U.S. on security and trade, without fully shutting the door on China. Still, her position remains complicated. She recently met with both former U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping at the G20 summit, signaling that she wants to keep her options open. Meanwhile, Trump has described his conversation with Sheinbaum as great, but he hasn't backed down from his 25% tariff threat. And then there's the looming 2026 USMCA review. Pressure is mounting for Mexico to take a harder stance against China's growing role in its economy. If it doesn't, tensions with the US could escalate further. Meanwhile, in the industrial parks of Coahuila, thousands of workers continue assembling pickup trucks and auto parts, sending them north to the US. But an air of uncertainty hangs over these factories. For now, China is playing the long game. The Beijing government knows that the trade war between the US and Mexico could work to its advantage. If tensions rise, China's influence in Mexico might grow even stronger in the coming year. And with new tariffs possibly on the horizon, the next chapter in this economic battle is just beginning. Did you find this video interesting? If so, be sure to smash that like button for us. See you in our next video.